What are the cultural and value characteristics of Anglosphere nations, represented by Britain and America? How did their celebrated tradition of liberty come about? And what impact has it had on these countries and the world at large? The author of this book is Daniel Hannan, a British intellectual who wears two hats. He's both a renowned historian and a politician. In classical terms, he exemplifies the scholar-statesman tradition, or what we might call today a fusion of academic and political expertise. Hannan's credentials are impressive on both fronts. As a politician, he serves as a member of the European Parliament and Secretary-General of the Conservative and Reform Group, with such high political standing that he's considered a potential future prime minister. As a scholar, he has authored several influential books, each making significant contributions to their fields. Regarding Hannan's political identity, it's worth noting that he aligns with conservatism, not in the traditional sense, but in the Western context where conservatism means preserving liberty. Hannan champions the Anglo-Saxon tradition of freedom, which is crucial to understanding his motivation for writing Inventing Freedom. Before delving into the book, we need to understand the concept of the Anglosphere. Hannan presents this as a story of liberty, or more specifically, the story of the Anglosphere. The term Anglo-Saxon originally referred to Britain's ancient dominant ethnic group and later became synonymous with British identity. The Anglosphere is variously described as Anglo-Saxon democratic nations, the Anglo-American alliance, or the Anglo-cultural sphere. The Oxford English Dictionary defines it as the group of nations where English is the primary native language. Author James Bennett offers a more comprehensive interpretation. Membership in the Anglosphere requires adherence to core English cultural values, including individual liberty, rule of law, and emphasis on contracts and agreements. Liberty stands as the primary pursuit in political and cultural values. Anglosphere nations share common historical touchstones: the Magna Carta, the British and American Bills of Rights, trial by jury, presumption of innocence, and common law principles like a man's home is his castle. This definition reveals the Anglosphere as both a cultural and political concept. The core Anglosphere comprises 5 nations: Britain, the United States, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. Its periphery includes Ireland, Singapore, former British colonies, Bermuda, the Falkland Islands, Caribbean democracies, and South Africa. India's inclusion remains debatable. The Anglosphere is a loose association of nations, perhaps not even an association in the strict sense. To draw a modern parallel, it's somewhat like a social media network of nations. Despite this loose structure, these nations share nearly identical principles, and their combined political civilization wields global influence. What's the source of this power? What's the secret of the Anglosphere? Let's explore these questions as we open Inventing Freedom. Generally speaking, when tracing the origins of the modern world through British history, many start with the Magna Carta of 1215. However, we need to look even further back, beyond the Magna Carta, to examine Britain's common law tradition and the Witenagemot. Let's begin with the common law tradition. The 10th century was Britain's golden age, a time of national unity, economic prosperity, and social harmony. These conditions fostered the development of legal concepts. With undisputed national authority and a stable government, people preferred settling disputes in courts rather than taking matters into their own hands. This gave rise to a legal system based on precedent and custom rather than written statutes, the common law, which English-speaking nations still pride themselves on today. Regarding common law, there are 4 key characteristics. First, it emphasizes private property rights and freedom of contract. Second, it operates on the principle that what isn't prohibited is permitted. Third, monitoring state laws is everyone's responsibility. Fourth, law belongs to the nation, not the king. This required a tribunal reflecting public opinion, the Witenagemot, predecessor to today's parliament. The Witenagemot originated from shires and hundreds, administrative divisions similar to counties and districts. Its members included major landowners, high-ranking clergy, and hereditary property holders, all local elites. Beyond resolving legal disputes, they discussed tax rates and public affairs, essentially functioning as an early form of local parliament. Here's a telling example. In 1014, Britain faced a crisis when the Danes occupied London, and King Ethelred the Unready fled to Normandy, the same Normandy famous for the D-Day landings. The Witenagemot offered him a chance to reclaim his throne, with conditions: no excessive taxation, adherence to ancient laws, and acceptance of the Witenagemot's guidance. This was a remarkable development, often overlooked. When we examine the history of liberty in the English-speaking world, particularly the principle of parliamentary supremacy over monarchy, historians typically cite the Magna Carta, the Glorious Revolution, and the American Revolution. Yet here, 2 centuries before the Magna Carta, we see the precursor to the Glorious Revolution of 1688. Kingship was conditional, and law stood above the king. Following the common law tradition and Witenagemot, we come to the familiar story of the Magna Carta. As previously discussed in works like The Plantagenets, the notorious King John's reign was marked by military defeats against France, losing Normandy, Anjou, Maine, and Touraine. Subsequently, his conflict with Pope Innocent III led to his excommunication. Later, he was forced to pledge allegiance to the Pope and pay 13,000 marks annually to the Holy See. Though not a huge sum, it completely destroyed his dignity as king and left him with no credibility before his subjects. He made enemies on all fronts domestically, not only exploiting the common people, but also targeting feudal lords, even directly confiscating their estates, turning these former allies among the nobility into fierce opponents. In 1213, King John launched another campaign against France, but was defeated in the famous Battle of Bouvines the following year, leading to an uprising by the opposition. On May 17, 1215, the feudal barons, supported by London citizens, occupied London and held King John captive. A month later, John was forced to sign the Magna Carta. In modern terms, this meant constraining power within the bounds of law. It's important to note that the Magna Carta's value lay not in its immediate impact, but in its future significance. Under armed pressure, King John signed with little sincerity. Once the barons left London and returned to their estates, John immediately revoked the charter. Pope Innocent III supported him, condemning the Magna Carta as shameful terms forced upon the king through violence and fear. Civil war ensued in England. On October 18, 1216, at the height of the conflict, King John died, his greatest contribution to England. His son Henry III succeeded him at just 9 years old. After ascending to the throne, the new king issued the Magna Carta 3 times, though reduced from 63 to 37 clauses, removing several that limited royal power. The spread of the Magna Carta wasn't as romantic as some historians suggest. Until the 17th century, it was largely forgotten by the English. Particularly during the Tudor period, 1485 to 1603, royal power was greatly strengthened, and the Magna Carta was practically meaningless. In the 17th century, as aristocratic power declined and the merchant and middle classes rose, they discovered the Magna Carta in old archives and used it as a weapon against royal authority. They ultimately prevailed, and the Magna Carta was elevated to sacred status. The Magna Carta is considered the political Bible of the English-speaking peoples, nurturing not only Britain but also America. More broadly, it's a glory of the modern world. Clause 39's significance cannot be overstated. No free man shall be seized or imprisoned, or stripped of his rights or possessions, or outlawed or exiled, or deprived of his standing in any way, except by the lawful judgment of his equals or by the law of the land. These words still stir emotions even after 1,000 years. Following the common law tradition, the Wise Counsel, and the Magna Carta, the narrative focuses on 2 wars, the First and Second Anglo-Civil Wars. The First Anglo-Civil War is what we typically call the English Civil Revolution. This terminology isn't merely academic posturing. Instead, this leads us to the Second Anglo-Civil War and the American War of Independence. Although the First Anglo-Civil War began in 1642 and military operations ended completely in 1651, Hannan considers the Glorious Revolution of 1688 and the Bill of Rights of 1689 as the true endpoint of the Civil War. Hannan describes the Glorious Revolution as the takeoff moment for the Anglosphere. From this point, the Anglosphere developed a system of limited government, individualism, and commercial focus, and began looking outward to the world, establishing a powerful navy, replacing old practices of bribery and monopoly with modern enterprises, and expanding into global markets. This clearly distinguished it from the evolutionary trends of other European nations. Hannan's commentary on the Bill of Rights deserves special attention. He believes that both the formation and content of the Bill of Rights closely resembles America's Declaration of Independence and can be seen as a precursor to the U.S. Constitution. However, the drafters weren't looking forward but backward, not to the future but to the past, from various pre-Civil War petitions back to the Magna Carta. They weren't creating new laws but reaffirming the long-standing Anglo traditions of liberty, including common law, Magna Carta, and representative government. Through the Bill of Rights, these dormant legacies finally awakened formal constitutional power. The Second Anglo-Civil War, as our history textbooks call it, is the American War of Independence. Typically, this war is viewed as between America and Britain, or between the American colonies and Great Britain. In Hannan's view, this popular notion represents a misalignment of perspective. The term War of Independence itself is somewhat misleading as it suggests another nation's rule over American territory. Why do such misconceptions exist? Because some people only see nations, failing to recognize that certain elements, ideas, institutions, culture, transcend national boundaries. Hannan characterizes the American War of Independence as a conflict between Loyalists and Whigs. American Loyalists were faithful to British institutions, particularly the joint rule of king and parliament. American Whigs were loyal to British values, rising up when these values were violated by the British crown. In essence, he's saying this was an internal conflict of Anglo values, a family matter among English-speaking peoples. Why use the term independence? Only when France entered the war in 1778 did it evolve into an international conflict. Calling the American War of Independence the Second Anglo-Civil War isn't just because America was within the Anglosphere. It's also because America's founding values weren't innovative but inherited. Hannan points out that America's founding fathers consistently identified as conservatives, never revolutionaries. In their view, they were simply defending the liberty heritage that was their birthright as Englishmen. After discussing these two Anglo-Civil Wars, let's shift our focus from Britain and America to the broader global perspective. As mentioned earlier, the Anglosphere comprises 5 core nations, with Britain as the mother, America as the firstborn, and Australia as the second son. As often happens in families with 3 or more sons, the second son tends to receive the least attention. This was Australia's position, quite different from America's first pioneers from Britain. They were a group of Puritans who fled their homeland due to brutal persecution by the Church of England. The first British arrivals in Australia were convicts. In 1787, the first fleet consisting of 11 ships departed from Portsmouth, England, bound for Australia. The British on board fell into 2 categories: 348 administrators, including officials, sailors, and naval personnel, and 696 convicts, exactly double the number of administrators, a curious coincidence. This was just the first wave. The last convicts would arrive in Australia in 1868. Over these 80 years, 164,000 people were transported from Britain to Australia. These exiles were mainly thieves, political radicals, and insubordinate sailors. Ironically, these outcasts, rejected by their homeland, brought the seeds of modern civilization to Australia. Meanwhile, the unfortunate indigenous people became innocent victims. Colonialism was a double-edged sword, though Hannan clearly emphasized its civilizing aspect. He wrote grandly, "The great red continent of Australia is not a displaced Britain, but rather an expanding Britain." Hannan's praise of Australia had its purpose. Australia remained steadfastly loyal to Britain, and John Howard, former Australian Prime Minister, was the first government leader to publicly use the concept of the Anglosphere. In 2010, Howard gave a speech in America, stating that the 5 Anglosphere nations formed the world's closest intelligence-sharing network. In his view, the Anglosphere's characteristics included individual freedom, common law, representative government, and crucially, the willingness to use force when necessary to defend these values. Defending freedom is a long and rich heritage, he concluded. Howard mentioned India's Anglosphere characteristics, which brings us to Mahatma Gandhi. Why did Gandhi succeed? Why did nonviolent non-cooperation work? It was inseparable from British civilization. As a nation that suffered under colonialism, we naturally oppose it. However, we must acknowledge differences among colonizers. Had the colonizer been Nazi Germany or Imperial Japan instead of Britain, Gandhi's nonviolent non-cooperation movement would have had no chance of success, and India could not have independently pursued democracy. During World War I, Gandhi told the Indian Congress, "Without the British, there would be no modern India. If Britain falls, to whom shall we appeal for equal partnership? The victorious Germans? The Turks? The Afghans? We have no right to do so. When freedom-loving British people see us fighting alongside them, they will surely triumph." Regardless of motives, Britain left India a precious legacy of property rights, market economy, and rule of law. To summarize this book, Hannan sought to trace the origins of the modern world, starting from the Germanic forests at the beginning of the Common Era, describing how the seeds of freedom were sown, took root, blossomed, and bore fruit. However, regardless of how glorious the history or how great Hannan's ancestors were, they must face the stark reality of our modern world, as problematic as it may be. The Anglosphere has undergone a fatal transformation, even a fundamental change. English-speaking countries are moving in directions opposite to their traditions: unification, centralization, high taxation, and state control. Take Hannan's homeland, Britain, for example. Britain has lost its leadership not only globally, but even within Europe, forcing it to bow to continental European countries and follow their trends. Within the Anglosphere, America has replaced Britain's position. As for the United States, during Hannan's writing of this book, Barack Obama was president, someone Hannan deeply disliked. Obama not only showed little affection for Britain, but also downplayed the alliance with India and nearly clashed with Canada over offshore drilling rights. Meanwhile, Obama cozied up to the EU, sweet-talking them and telling EU leaders that America had been too arrogant in the past. In Hannan's view, Obama was the greatest destroyer and number one enemy of the Anglosphere. This frustration is evident throughout the book's conclusion. Of course, when reading The Freedom Gene, we must consider both its strengths and limitations. The book's biggest flaw is the author's unconcealed sense of British and ideological superiority. Hannan desperately tries to link the English-speaking peoples with liberty, almost claiming freedom as their exclusive patent. For instance, he claims the religion of English-speaking peoples is the guardian of political freedom. British law exists not to control individuals, but to grant them freedom, and English is both the carrier and protector of liberty. These expressions are overwhelmingly self-righteous. However, if we consider Hannan's identity not just as a historian, but also as a politician, and understand his earnest attempt to salvage the dissolving Anglosphere and Britain's decline through this book, we can somewhat forgive its various shortcomings.